The morning my husband asked for a divorce, he was already dressed for work. Suit pressed, coffee in hand, standing by the kitchen island like he was about to present quarterly numbers instead of end our marriage. "I think we both know this hasn't been working," he said. I was still in my robe. I hadn't even had coffee yet. "His name is Theron. Theron Ashby. We met when I was 26, married at 28, and I spent the next 4 years slowly becoming someone I didn't recognize. Quieter, smaller, always adjusting myself to fit the space he left for me. We had a daughter, Ivy. She was 3 years old and asleep in the next room while her father told me our marriage was over. I didn't cry. I remember being surprised by that. I just looked at him and said, "Okay, when did you decide this?" He set his coffee cup down. "We can talk about the details later. I have a meeting." That was it. He picked up his keys and left. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. The sun was coming through the window over the sink, hitting the backsplash tiles, and I just stood there thinking, I should have seen this coming. The late nights. The texts he angled away from me. The business trip to Phoenix that lasted 9 days when his colleague later mentioned it had only been a 4-day conference. I should have asked questions sooner. But I didn't, because I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. Theron had a way of making me feel like my instincts were a personality flaw. His mother, Renata, called me that same afternoon. She lived 20 minutes away in the house she'd owned for 30 years, a wide colonial with the garden out back that she tended every weekend without fail. Theron had grown up there. His father passed when Theron was in his 30s, and since then Renata had been alone in that house, rattling around in it, watering her roses, feeding a cat named Mr. Porter. "He told me," she said when I picked up. Her voice was flat. Not flat like she was hiding something. Flat like she was tired. "Clara, I want you to know I'm not happy about this." I told her I appreciated that. "Are you all right?" I said. "I didn't know yet." There was a long pause. Then she said, "Can I come over Saturday? I want to see Ivy." I said yes. The next 2 weeks were a slow unraveling. Theron moved into what he called temporary accommodations, which turned out to be a 1-bedroom apartment in Midtown that, I later found out, he had signed the lease on 6 weeks before he ever said the word divorce to me. He'd been planning it. While I was signing Ivy up for preschool and scheduling her pediatric checkups and making grocery lists that included his preferred brand of sparkling water, he was planning it, our attorney. Mine, not his, was a woman named Suzanne who had been doing family law for 20 years and had the kind of calm that comes from having seen every flavor of marital collapse. She sat across from me in her office and laid it out plainly. "Given your income differential and the length of the marriage, you have a reasonable claim to a significant share of marital assets," she said. "And custody, given that you've been the primary caregiver, is something we can build a strong case around." I nodded. I was barely hearing her. "Clara," she leaned forward slightly. "I need you to be present for this. There's a lot at stake." She was right, but the number Theron's attorney had put on the table was laughable. A lump sum, our jointly owned SUV, and use of the house for 60 days while I made arrangements. No mention of ongoing support, no real custody framework, just a number designed to make me go away. $40,000 and 60 days. That's what 4 years of my life was worth to him, apparently. I told Suzanne I needed to think. What I didn't tell her was that I already had a different idea forming. Renata came on Saturday like she said she would. She brought a casserole, which made me almost laugh. This elaborate baked ziti, enough to feed 8 people, just for me and a 3-year-old. She set it on the counter and then she hugged me and I stood in her arms like a collapsed tent. "I raised him," she said, "into the top of my head. I know what he is. I'm sorry I didn't warn you better." I pulled back and looked at her. She was 71, still sharp, still straight-backed. She had Theron's jaw and his dark eyes, but where his face had a quality I could only describe as calculated, hers just looked like someone who had been watching the world carefully for a very long time. "Renata," I said, "can I ask you something honestly? Always? How bad is it? What do you know?" She sat down at the kitchen table. She folded her hands, and she told me. Her name was Priya. She worked in Theron's office, not as his assistant, but as a project coordinator on his team. They had been together, Renata believed, for nearly a year. Maybe longer. Renata had met her once, accidentally, when she'd stopped by Theron's building to drop off some papers he'd left at her house. He'd introduced Priya as a colleague, but Renata had watched the way Priya touched his arm when she thought no one was looking. I didn't have proof, Renata said. I had a feeling. And with Theron, he always has an explanation. He's been that way since he was 17. I asked her what she meant. She looked out the window for a moment. His father left us when Theron was 16. I don't know if he ever told you that. He had it. Theron had always told me his father died when he was in his 30s. I'd even attended a memorial with him. I'd cried. Renata watched my face process that. There was no accident, she said quietly. His father left for another woman. Theron couldn't handle it, so he built a different story. And then, I think, he forgot the real one. I sat with that for a long moment. I don't know what you're going to do, Renata said. But whatever it is, I'm on your side. Not his. Theron's next offer came through Suzanne 2 weeks later. He bumped the number slightly, $55,000, and offered every other weekend custody. Primary residence with him. Ivy had never spent a night away from me in her life. Theron had attended maybe a third of her pediatrician appointments. He didn't know the name of her preschool teacher. He didn't know she was afraid of the smoke alarm because it had gone off once while she was eating breakfast, and she cried for an hour. I told Suzanne to decline. And then I did something that I'd been turning over in my mind for 2 weeks. I called Renata and I asked her a question I had no right to ask. I know this is a lot, I said, and I know he's your son. But if I really fight this, I'm going to need support, not financial necessarily, just someone in my corner who knows him. Someone who can speak to who he actually is. There was a long silence. What are you asking me, Clara? I'm asking if you'd be willing to tell the truth, if it came to that. Another silence. Then, I've been waiting for someone to ask me that for about 30 years. What followed was 3 months of legal back and forth that I will not pretend was anything other than brutal. Theron's attorney tried to paint me as financially dependent and emotionally unstable, a woman who had chosen not to maintain employment during the marriage, which was technically true. I had left my job as a hospital administrator when Ivy was born, because we had agreed together that I would stay home for the first few years. We had agreed. I had emails. Suzanne presented the emails. Theron's attorney pivoted. They began suggesting that I had been resistant to co-parenting communication, that I had made it difficult for Theron to be involved. Suzanne presented Ivy's pediatric records, which showed me present at every single appointment, and Theron at 4 out of 26. Then something shifted. I got a call from Suzanne on a Tuesday afternoon, and her voice had a different quality than usual, something almost careful. Are you sitting down? I sat. We received some documents today. From an anonymous source, financial records, specifically transfers from a joint investment account you and Theron held that were moved into a private account registered to Priya Mehta, beginning approximately 14 months ago. I felt the air go out of the room. That's marital asset dissipation, Suzanne said, and it changes things considerably. I thought about Renata. I thought about how she'd said she didn't have proof. I thought about the fact that she had worked as a bookkeeper for 30 years before she retired, and she still kept meticulous records of everything, out of habit. I didn't ask where the documents came from. I think Suzanne suspected, but she didn't ask either. Here is what the next month looked like. Theron's confident posture in mediation cracking, degree by degree. First, the documents. Then Suzanne's request for a full forensic accounting of our marital assets. Then, the discovery that the apartment in Midtown, temporary accommodations, had actually been furnished using $14,000 from the same investment account. His attorney got quieter. Theron got angrier. I sat across from him in a mediator's conference room on a rainy Wednesday in March, and I watched him understand, for the first time, that this was not going to go the way he planned. You had no right to go through my records, he said across the table. I didn't, I said. They're marital records. They belong to both of us. He looked at me like I was a stranger. Maybe I was, by then. I want to be honest, I didn't feel triumphant in that moment. I felt tired. I felt sad for the person I'd been 4 years ago, standing at an altar believing I was building something real. I felt sad for Ivy, who was going to grow up shuttling between 2 homes because her father had decided that what he wanted mattered more than what we'd built. But I didn't look away from him. The custody evaluation took 6 weeks. A specialist, a child psychologist named Dr. Alderman, met with both of us separately, met with Ivy, observed me with Ivy, observed Theron with Ivy. Theron brought Priya to one of his sessions with Ivy. He introduced her, Dr. Turdavy. Alderman noted at her report. When the evaluation was complete, Dr. Alderman's recommendation was primary physical custody with me, with structured parenting time for Theron on alternate weekends and 1 evening per week. She cited Ivy's established routines, her attachment patterns, and the stability of her current living environment. She also noted, carefully, that introducing a new partner during an active custody evaluation showed a possible lack of awareness of the child's emotional needs during this transitional period. I read that line 4 times. The final settlement took another month to negotiate. What I received? Primary custody of Ivy. The house, which we had purchased together and which still had 7 years on the mortgage, but which Suzanne negotiated for me to keep with Theron buying out his half in a structured payment, spousal support for 3 years while I transitioned back to work, and a reversal of the dissipated assets. A full accounting of what had been moved and equitable compensation. It was not a perfect outcome. There is no perfect outcome. There is no perfect outcome when a family dissolves, but it was fair, and fair was something I had stopped expecting about halfway through this process. Theron signed the papers on a Thursday. His attorney handed them across the table. He didn't look at me. I looked at him. I thought about the man I'd married. I thought about all the things I would have said to him, once. All the anger and grief I'd carried for months. In the end, I just signed where Suzanne indicated and put the pen down. Outside, it was a clear day. The kind of cold, bright March afternoon that feels like a promise. I want to tell you about Renata. After the divorce was finalized, Theron did not speak to her for 4 months. She told me this herself, plainly, without self-pity. He's done this before, she said. When things don't go his way, he disappears. He comes back eventually. She still came over on Saturdays. She still brought food, not always a casserole, sometimes pie, sometimes just a container of homemade soup. She sat in my kitchen and she played with Ivy and she told me stories about her own life that I had never heard before. About how she'd worked 2 jobs for 7 years after Theron's father left. About how she'd almost sold the house twice and talked herself out of it both times. About the trip she'd always wanted to take to Portugal but never had. In September, 6 months after the divorce was final, I booked 2 tickets to Lisbon. You're not serious, she said when I showed her the confirmation. You have a passport? I have a passport I've had for 15 years and never used. Perfect. We went for 10 days. Ivy stayed with my mother, who was thrilled. Renata and I walked through neighborhoods with names we couldn't pronounce. Ate dinner at 9 o'clock because that was when the restaurants filled up, and drank wine on a terrace overlooking the Tagus River while the sky turned colors. I don't have words for. On the 3rd night, she looked at me across the table and said, I owe you an apology. I told her she didn't. I do, she said. I saw who he was becoming and I hoped I was wrong. Mothers do that. I hoped you'd be the thing that changed him. She paused. That wasn't fair to you. I thought about it. You came through when it mattered. That should have been years earlier. I didn't argue, but I reached across the table and squeezed her hand and she let me. And we sat like that for a while, with the river below us and the evening opening up around us like something we both earned. When we came home, there was a voicemail on my phone from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't listen to it. It was Theron. His voice was different than I remembered. Quieter, rougher somehow. He said he'd been thinking. He said he knew he hadn't been. He paused. He said he knew he'd made choices that weren't fair. He said he was going to try to do better with Ivy. He said he was sorry. He didn't say sorry to me specifically. He said sorry like it was floating in the air between us, unaddressed to anyone. I listened to it twice. Then I saved it, because I thought someday Ivy might want to know that he'd said it. I didn't call him back that day. I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee and watched Ivy run in the yard. This small, serious, determined person who was somehow mine to raise. And I thought about what comes after. Not revenge, not vindication. Just what comes after. I had an interview the following Monday at a hospital network downtown for a director-level position that was a step up from where I'd been before I left. Suzanne had told me when the settlement was finalized that I was in a stronger financial position than I probably realized. The house was mine. The support payments were structured. "You have time to be strategic," she said. "Don't rush." I wasn't rushing. For the first time in years, I actually wasn't. I got the job. Ivy started pre-K in September and announced on the third day that her teacher was the best person she'd ever met, which I chose not to take personally. Renata came every Saturday. Mr. Porter the cat developed an attachment to Ivy that surprised everyone, including Mr. Porter. Theron took Ivy on his alternate weekends. The first few exchanges were stiff and careful, two people being excessively polite around a 3-year-old who didn't understand the performance, but he showed up. And he was, I'll give him this, more present with her than he'd been during the marriage. Maybe the structure forced something out of him. Maybe losing easy access to her made him realize she was real. I don't know what happened with Priya. I didn't ask and nobody told me. I know that around November, Renata mentioned he called her. She said the conversation was short and awkward and ended with him saying he'd been doing some thinking. She said she told him she was glad to hear it. She didn't elaborate and I didn't push. Here's what I know now, that I didn't know before. I know that the version of myself who stood in that kitchen in her robe, not yet crying, not yet understanding, she was already starting to hold herself together. She just didn't know it yet. I know that not fighting doesn't mean losing. I never screamed at Theron. I never sent the long texts I drafted at 2 a.m. I never showed up at his building or called Priya or made a scene at the one mutual social event we attended in the same month. Not because I was above it. I wasn't. But because I decided early on that my energy had one job, Ivy. Everything else was noise. I know that the people who show up for you in the worst moments of your life are often not the ones you expected. My mother drove 4 hours to stay with me the week Theron first moved out. My college roommate, who I'd barely talked to in 2 years, called me every Sunday for 3 months. And Renata, his mother, technically my former mother-in-law, became one of the closest people in my life. We don't have a word for what she is to me now. Former mother-in-law sounds clinical and wrong. Family feels right but complicated. Maybe it doesn't need a word. She comes on Saturdays. She brings soup. Ivy calls her Grandma Rennie and runs to the door when she hears the car pull up. Some things are just what they are. Last April, almost exactly 2 years after Theron stood in our kitchen with his coffee and ended our marriage, I was sitting on the back porch again. Same porch, different version of me. And Renata was inside with Ivy. And I could hear them laughing about something, and the sound came through the screen door into the evening air, and I thought, I didn't plan for this. Any of this. I didn't plan to lose the marriage or fight for my daughter or fly to Portugal or start over at 32. But I'm here. And it's mine, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, it's enough. I've thought a lot about what actually happened. Not the legal version, not the clean story I sometimes tell when people ask how I got through it. The real version, which is messier and less satisfying and also, somehow, more true. Theron didn't lose because I was clever. He lost because of what he actually was. The transfers, the hidden apartment, the lease signed 6 weeks before he ever said the word divorce to my face. None of that was something I engineered. It was already there, waiting to be found, because he had never once believed he would face any real consequence for what he chose to do. That's the thing about people who get away with a lot for a long time. They stop being careful. They start believing the rules genuinely don't apply to them. And then one day, they find out they were wrong. I used to think that justice required someone to fight for it, that you had to chase it down, force it, demand it loudly. What I learned is that sometimes justice is just the natural weight of a person's own choices finally landing on them. Theron built something dishonest, and it collapsed under its own structure. I didn't knock it over. I just stepped out of the way. The harder lesson, the one I'm still sitting with, is about what it costs to stay quiet when you know something is wrong. Renata knew. She had known for a long time who her son was capable of being, and she stayed quiet out of something that looked like love but was really closer to fear. Fear of losing him, fear of being wrong, fear of the conversation that would follow. And that silence had a cost, not just to her but to me and in a different way, to Ivy. When she finally told the truth, it changed everything. But it came later than it should have. I don't say that to blame her. I say it because I recognize the same tendency in myself. How many times did I know something was off and decide I was probably imagining it? How many times did I choose the easier explanation because the real one was too uncomfortable to hold? That's not weakness exactly. It's human. But it's also something worth looking at honestly, because the longer you let it go, the more it costs you later. What I want Ivy to understand someday, when she's old enough to understand it, is that intelligence isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being willing to see things clearly, even when seeing them clearly is painful. And integrity isn't about being perfect. It's about what you do when no one is making you do anything. Theron had every reason to be a decent husband and father, and he chose differently, consistently, over years. That was a choice. Every single day of it was a choice. And I had a choice too. I could have shrunk. I could have taken the first offer, $55,000 in every other weekend with my own daughter. And I could have told myself I was being practical. Part of me wanted to. The part that was exhausted and scared and didn't want to fight anymore. But Renata sat in my kitchen and told me the truth. And Suzanne put a pen in my hand and told me to pay attention. And Ivy ran around in the backyard not knowing any of it, just trusting that I was going to figure it out. That's enough. That has always been enough. The rest, the house, the job, the trip to Lisbon, the Saturday soups, that all came later. It came because I kept going when I didn't particularly want to. Not heroically, just steadily. One Thursday at a time. That's what I know now that I didn't know before.